I'll try to keep this short because everything is written on the screen. So the first question is, how are laws passed in the federal political system? All laws are passed by the legislative branch of government. So what happens is that an MP, usually a cabinet minister, will introduce a bill. That bill then goes through a first reading. The first reading is usually everyone just looks at the bill itself. They look at printed copies of the bill, and there's no real vote or debate or anything like that. After that, you have the second one, which is that the second reading, they debate the bill, they debate the principles of the bill, and then they decide whether it's worth going to a committee stage. At the committee stage is where it actually gets flushed out. And who is involved in the committee stage are concerned citizens. So if you are building a pipeline in northern Calgary, you'll have the MP from North Calgary. You'll maybe have an oil executive. You'll have an environmentalist. You'll have engineers. You'll have, I don't know, maybe just a normal workers who work in the oil fields. You might have regular people who live in North Calgary who might be concerned about this oil pipeline being put up there. So you'll have concerned citizens as well as a lot of professionals, as well as MPs, as well as senators. This is one of the roles that senators play, is they play committee roles. So it goes to the committee, they argue and they debate, and then they come up with a decision. They write the bill. They rewrite the bill usually. Then it goes to the report stage where members of parliament, where the House of Commons argues over what the committee created, and they will often create amendments, send it back to the committee to make those changes, and it goes back and forth between report and committee for a little while until it looks good enough to actually go to a vote. When it's ready to go for a vote, it goes to third reading. Usually by now, it's the party in power. If it's a majority government, the party in power will make sure it passes no matter at what stage it's at. So the opposition party will usually vote against it just because that's what they do, and it'll move past the third reading. After the third reading, it goes to the Senate, so the Senate can make any adjustments they want. Usually they don't. Usually by now it's been refined enough that the Senate just makes sure that it doesn't have anything weird in it, doesn't have anything people would be against. And then it gets signed. It gets signed by our Governor General, who is the representative of the Queen, and it's called giving royal assent. Once it has royal assent, it's law. So a bill becomes a law. All right. The next question is, what is the relationship between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government? So, as we were just saying, the legislative branch is the one who actually passes laws. They actually make the laws. And the legislative branch is MPs and senators. So you have MPs who are introducing them, you have senators who are voting on them, you have MPs who are voting on them, you have senators and MPs making changes in the committee stage, etc. They make the law. That is the role of the legislative branch, to make laws. The executive branch consists of the Crown and the Governor General, but also primarily the ones we're worried about, or the people we mean when we say executive branch are the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are part of the executive, and they carry out the laws. So remember what I said about the Cabinet. The Cabinet consists of a whole bunch of members of Parliament who each have a different department. Each of these Cabinet members represent one aspect of Canada. So you'll have the Department of Defense. You'll have the Department of Defense and a Minister of Defense. So the Minister of Defense is in charge of anything that's military related. You'll have a Minister of the Environment. They care about anything that relates to environment. You'll have a Minister of Veteran Affairs. You'll have a Minister of Transportation. And these people deal with those sections of Canada. Each minister has their own section of Canada they deal with. So let's say the legislative branch passes a law that says all trains have to get inspected. All trains have to get inspected every 2 weeks. It's like, okay, well, who carries that law out?
Okay.
That law is carried out by the executive branch. So, legislative branch makes a law. All trains need to be inspected every 2 weeks. The executive branch says that, okay, we're going to do that. It would be the Minister of Transportation who actually makes sure that trains now all get inspected every 2 weeks. That would be his or her job as the Minister for Transportation. That's what it means to carry out the laws made by the legislative branch. Now, the judicial branch they have a very interesting job because they interpret the laws. So at the very height of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, but there's other courts that are beneath that. There's the federal courts, there's the appeals courts, there's provincial courts, etc. You don't have to memorize all the courts, just know there's different levels with the Supreme Court at the top. What that means to, when the judicial branch interprets laws, what that means is, let's say they do pass a law saying all trains need to be inspected every 2 weeks. Well, suddenly Heritage Park says, well, we have a train. Heritage Park says we have a train. Do we have to get inspected every 2 weeks? That's ridiculous. So they go to the judicial branch and say, hey, judicial branch, could you interpret this law and tell us if it applies to us? Does the new train law, does that actually apply to our train and other trains in parks and other trains in carnival trains and stuff? Like, what does it apply to? The judicial branch would make that decision. So they interpret the laws made by the legislative branch. So, recap. Legislative branch, they're the ones who make the laws. Executive branch carry them out, make sure they happen, and the judicial branch interprets them. The next question is about the differences between MPs, members of parliament, and senators. The difference is pretty straightforward. Members of parliament are elected, senators are not. So members of parliament, how do they get their job? Is that members of parliament have to get elected from ridings or constituencies. Remember, the word riding and constituency mean the same thing. They're synonymous. So Canada is split up into a whole bunch of different sections. Each section has approximately 100 to 120,000 citizens, and each of those sections, each of those quadrants, each of those ridings, each elect one MP to represent that 100,000 people. So, for example, Calgary is split into 10 different ridings because we have about 1 million people, and so that means 100,000 each. That means we have 10 different ridings. Northern Alberta only has like 3 ridings because way up north, you need massive sections of land to find 100,000 people in. So there's only 3 MPs that represent all of Northern Alberta, whereas there's 10 or 11 who represent Calgary alone. So that's how members of parliament get their job, is they're elected from different ridings or constituencies. Senators, on the other hand, are appointed by the prime minister. So they're appointed by the prime minister, meaning that whenever a position opens up for a senator, the prime minister decides who would best go in that spot. It doesn't have to be a politician. It could be anybody. Sometimes old newscasters, sometimes old people who have lawyers or judges take those positions. Whomever the prime minister thinks would best serve the job of representing minorities and regions. You see, senators, their primary job is to vote and be on committees in order to create laws. But on top of that, they are responsible for minorities, and they are responsible for different regions. You see, MPs are responsible for their ridings, but if a riding only has 4% of a minority, which is likely because that's why they're called a minority, is because there's a minority of them, then they're never going to feel like their voice is getting heard. It's senators' jobs to represent the voice of minorities. It's also their job to represent different regions. For example, the north of Canada. There's so few people in northern Canada that their voice is rarely heard. So it's the senators' job to represent these different regions of Canada. Not just far out regions, but, the plains, the Maritimes, northern Canada, eastern and western Canada, the centers, the Rocky Plains, and the tree-lined plains. Like, regions and minorities. That's who the senators represent. Members of parliament, they represent the citizens who voted for them, and they represent usually the party who they represent as well.